The offering. The village of Ashenvail had no soldiers left. 3 wars had taken them: the border conflict, the siege of the Twin Rivers, and the long grinding horror that men called the Ironfield Campaign but survivors simply called the end of things. 3 wars across 40 years, and each one had reached into Ashenvale like a hand into a nest, pulling out the young and the strong and the willing, until only the old and the broken and the very small remained. The village had been a proud thing once. Its elder Cornan could remember when the market days drew traders from as far as the Crescent Coast, when the inn had 3 stories and could not hold all its guests, when the sound of children playing filled every street from morning to dusk. That was before. The Fourth War was not like the others. The others had been human wars, full of human cruelty and human grief, fought for human reasons and at least comprehensible in the way that awful things can be comprehensible when you understand the minds behind them. The Fourth War had no proper name yet because most of those who might have named it were dead. In Ashenvale they called it only what it was: the War of Fire and Wingspan, the war that came from the sky. It had started in the mountain ranges to the north and east, where something ancient and vast had been disturbed by the passage of armies through passes that had not seen human feet in centuries. Scholars in the capital had theories that the dragon had been sleeping, that the armies had burned something sacred, that she had simply decided after long patience that she had been tolerant enough. Whatever the cause, the effect was unambiguous. Vraxen the Ashen had descended from the shattered peaks in the 3rd month of a brutal winter, and by spring, she had made her permanent residence in the ruins of the old fortress overlooking the valley of Ashenvale. The fortress had been abandoned for 2 generations. It sat on a shelf of black rock 800 feet above the valley floor, visible from nearly every point in the village, its broken towers and crumbling battlements having acquired a kind of scenic melancholy over the years. Children dared each other to climb the lower path. Occasionally a traveler would request directions to it as a curiosity. No one feared it. Then Vraxen came and the fortress became something else entirely. It became the shadow that fell on Ashenvale regardless of where the sun stood. It became the shape that the villagers tracked with the corner of their eyes even when they were trying not to look. It became the thing that woke them in the night, not always because of sound, but sometimes simply because their bodies knew she was there and would not let them rest in peace. She had razed 4 cities in 60 years. Not looted, not damaged, razed. The word had a finality to it that other words did not, and it was the correct word. Cornan the Elder had spoken with a traveling merchant who had been in Delmark during the burning, who had seen the dragon come over the eastern hills in the late afternoon light, a shape so enormous against the sky that his first thought had been that a storm was rolling in, before his second thought corrected the first with cold terror. The merchant said Delmark had ceased to exist by nightfall. The stones themselves had melted. She had swallowed knights whole, armor and all, as a man might eat a grape. There were accounts, reliable ones, from soldiers who had survived by fleeing, whose shame at their survival was evident in the telling of entire cavalry formations simply ceasing to be. Of war horses and armored riders disappearing between one breath and the next, leaving nothing behind but a scorched field and the memory of screaming. She had once, when an army had attempted to flank her territory through the northern pass, collapsed the mountain. Not a rockslide, the mountain. Witnesses from the valley below had described the peak folding inward, the whole upper quarter of the range dropping as if a foundation had been pulled, sealing the pass permanently under 100,000 tons of stone. The army had been on the other side and was never heard from again. The scholars, those brave and probably somewhat unhinged individuals who had devoted themselves to studying her from distances they hoped were sufficient, used the word deliberate consistently in their notes. That was the quality that distinguished Vraxen from other dangerous creatures. Other dangerous creatures were dangerous the way weather was dangerous, powerful, unpredictable, without malice. Vraxen was dangerous the way a general was dangerous. She made decisions. She assessed, calculated, considered. She did not destroy indiscriminately because indiscriminate destruction was inefficient. She destroyed precisely, and the precision was somehow worse than chaos would have been, because it meant she understood exactly what she was doing and chose to do it anyway. Not cruel, the scholars wrote, utterly without mercy. There is a distinction. This was what had come to nest above Ashenvale. This was the shadow on the valley. Villagers who remained, perhaps 300 down from over 1,000 at the start of the border conflict, had spent the first weeks of her arrival in a state of suspended terror, waiting for the fire to come. When it did not come immediately, they began to breathe again, cautiously, in the way of people who know the axe is still above them but have started to believe it might not fall today. A fragile equilibrium settled. She was there. She was vast and terrible. She had not yet destroyed them. They left offerings at the base of the fortress path. Food, at first a slaughtered goat, a crate of fish, a wheel of aged cheese that represented a significant portion of the village's stores. There was no indication these were noticed. They tried objects: a bronze mirror, some bolts of fine cloth, a carved wooden figure that the craftsman Aelith had spent a month on. Nothing. No acknowledgement of acknowledgement. What they received instead was silence and presence, and both felt like a held breath. The equilibrium lasted 2 years. Then a delegation of soldiers arrived from the capital, a lieutenant, 20 men and 2 mages bearing orders from the crown to assess the situation and, if feasible, neutralize the threat. Ashenvail's elder had explained carefully that neutralize was probably not a realistic outcome. The lieutenant had explained less carefully that his orders were his orders. The soldiers had gone up the fortress path on a cold morning in late autumn. They had not come back down. Vraxen had not come down to the valley afterward. She had simply returned to her silence, to her presence, to the patient shadow of her existence above them. But the message was received with perfect clarity. There were no negotiations available. There were no terms. There was only this: she was here and they were permitted to continue existing below her, and that permission was entirely conditional and could be revoked without notice. After that, the delegation from the capital solution was no longer proposed. It was in the 3rd year of her residency that Merritt, wife of a soldier who had not come home from Ironfield, developed a fever in early spring. She had a son, 8 months old, who had been born after his father's last leave and had never met him. The boy's name was Emric. He had his mother's jaw and, people said, his father's eyes, that particular shade of warm brown that was almost amber in good light. Merritt fought the fever for 11 days. On the 12th day she died, and Emric became the village's problem in the particular way that orphaned infants become community problems, with genuine sorrow, genuine willingness to help, and a very real shortage of resources to actually do so. The village had 3 nursing mothers, none of whom had much surplus. Winter stores were low. 3 families offered to take the child, each one making the offer with honest hearts and genuine worry about whether they could sustain it. It was in this context that Cornan the Elder made the decision that would mark the remainder of his life. He would say later, when the story had been told enough times to require retelling, that he had done what he believed necessary. He would say that the village had to think of its children, the ones already here, already eating, already needing, and that 1 infant against 300 lives was a calculation a leader had to be able to make. He would say all of this and people would nod, because the logic was sound and the logic was terrible and both things could be true at once. What he would not say, because he never found words for it that did not make him feel ill, was that there had been a moment, brief but real, when he had thought, this may satisfy her. An offering, a real one, not cheese or carved wood. He had kept that thought to himself and carried it alone, and it had the weight of a stone around his neck for the rest of his years. The preparations were made quietly and quickly, as unpleasant necessities tend to be. Cornan wrapped Emric in a wool cloth, good wool, not rough, because he could not quite make himself use rough wool, as though the quality of the fabric was a form of apology, and he prepared a small clay bowl of milk to place beside him, though he knew it was a futile gesture, that the boy would not be able to reach it, and that it was meant more to salve Cornan's conscience than to serve any practical purpose. He knew this and did it anyway. He carried the boy himself. He did not delegate this. If he was going to do it, he was going to do it himself, was going to bear the full weight of it without assigning that weight to someone else. This was perhaps the only honorable thing about the entire business. He went before dawn, when the village was asleep, when there was no crowd to make it a public thing and no witnesses to make it a memory others would carry. The path up to the fortress was well known to him. He had walked it enough times on various futile errands over the years, and he climbed it in darkness, the child warm and sleeping against his chest, and he set Emric down at the base of the great fortress steps with the clay bowl of milk beside him. Emric did not wake for this. He slept on, breathing the slow, even breaths of infancy, unknowing. Cornan stood over him for a moment that stretched itself into something he could not measure. Then he turned and walked back down the path, and he did not look back, and he went home, and he sat in his chair by the banked fire, and he did not sleep again that night. No one watched, no one wanted the memory of it. What they did not know, what they could not have known, having no source of information about the inner life of dragons, was what had happened to Vraxen 3 months before. She had returned to the fortress one evening from a ranging flight to find the nest empty. Not predation, she knew the signs of predation, knew the smell of it, knew the evidence it left behind. This had been a rival, an old male from the northern range, one she had known of for decades, one she had considered a manageable threat. She had underestimated the management required. He had come in her absence and taken the eggs, all 4 of them, and whatever he had done with them she did not know and could not know and did not allow herself to imagine. She had hunted him for 3 weeks. She had found evidence of his passage, scorched rock, the remnants of a meal, the claw marks he left on cliff faces as territorial declarations, but not him. He knew her range, he knew her methods. He had made himself absent in a way that suggested long planning, which meant this had not been opportunism. This had been intention. She returned to the fortress eventually because the fortress was hers, and because leaving it would be a concession she refused to make. She settled back into the routines of her existence with the careful, deliberate control that had always been her defining characteristic. She ate when she needed to eat and slept when she needed to sleep and maintained the perimeter with the same precision as before. She had not eaten in 63 days when the infant appeared at the base of her steps. She knew he was there before she descended. She had heard the footsteps on the lower path hours before dawn, one set adult, the careful tread of someone trying not to be heard, and she had heard the sounds that followed, soft cloth against stone, the quiet of the bowl being placed, the retreat of the adult feet back down the path. She had heard the breathing of something very small that was not, she recognized after a moment, one of the mountain creatures she catalogued by habit. She knew what it was. She had seen humans leave such things before, not at her fortress but at other places, other territories. It was an old practice, offering the very young to the things that frightened them. She had no use for it. She had no use for anything they left her, but this particular custom she found more distasteful than most, because it demonstrated the specific human capacity for taking the most helpless among them and using that helplessness as currency. She had decided, lying in the pre-dawn dark of the fortress, that she would leave it where it was. Let it be reclaimed or not. It was not her concern. She was not in the business of managing the consequences of human choices. She descended when the light began to come, because she descended at dawn as a matter of habit, because she liked the first light on the valley and would not alter her rituals because of a human infant at the bottom of her steps. She descended and she found him and she stopped. He was awake. She had assumed somehow that he would be asleep, and the wakefulness surprised her more than it should have. His eyes were open, dark in this light, wide, tracking, and when her shadow fell across him, when he became aware of her presence in the way that all creatures become aware of very large things that have suddenly appeared near them, he did not close his eyes and he did not scream. He looked at her. Vraxen stood motionless at the base of her own steps and looked back. She was trying, with the same careful assessment she applied to everything, to determine what she was seeing. She saw the obvious things, the smallness, the helplessness, the inadequacy of the cloth against the morning cold, the untouched milk in the clay bowl. She saw the marks of recent care and the older marks of recent deprivation, and she understood the shape of the story without needing the details. She saw an infant who had been alive long enough to expect that the world contained things which would come when he made certain sounds, and who had perhaps been making those sounds in the dark without response for some hours. All of this she saw and assessed and filed. What she had not expected, what she did not have an immediate analytical category for, was what he did next. He looked up at her. He looked at the full enormous fact of her, the scales that had withstood siege weapons, the claws that had torn down castle walls, the wingspan that cast a shadow like a passing cloud, and he considered all of it with those wide dark eyes, and then he reached up. A small fist extended toward her face, not in warding, in reaching. The gesture was without context and without logic. He could not have understood what she was. He could not have had any framework for the appropriate response to finding oneself at the foot of something that could end him without effort. He had simply seen something large and close and reached for it in the way that his kind reached for large, close things, with that specific undiscriminating trust that exists only before experience has taught the necessary suspicion. Vraxen stood motionless for a long time. She had stood motionless while kings made their cases and begged for their cities. She had stood motionless through the prayers of priests and the bargaining of generals and the weeping of mothers who offered everything they had for the return of what she'd taken. She was very good at motionless. It was one of her particular competencies. This was a different kind of motionless. This was the stillness of something that has encountered a situation for which it has no prepared response. She lowered her head. Slowly, with the enormous controlled precision that was required when one was her size and operating in proximity to something that could be ended by the wrong movement, she brought her head down and down until one dark amber eye was level with the child on the cold stone. She was close enough to see the details of him. The texture of the wool cloth, the dried evidence of tears on his face, the remarkable steadiness of his gaze, the way he seemed to be looking at her eye specifically, looking into it, with an attention that felt absurdly like recognition. He grabbed the ridge of her snout with both hands. Both small hands, wrapping as far as they could reach around the scale-ridged architecture of her face, holding on with the complete commitment of someone who has found something solid and intends to keep it. He held on and he made sounds, not crying, not screaming, but the formless, warm babbling of his kind, a noise like water over stones, like fire in wood, something that carried no translatable meaning and somehow did not need to. And something happened in Vraxen that she had no name for in her own language, which was a language precise enough to describe the 17 different qualities of fire and the exact nature of grief when it calcifies into something structural. Even that language did not have a word for this. A sound came out of her. She heard it come out of her and recognized that it had come out of her and filed the recognition away in the same careful way she filed everything, though she suspected this was one file she would never close. It was not the growl she used for warning. not the subsonic rumble she used when she wanted the ground to communicate her displeasure for her, not the sharp percussive sound she made at the beginning of engagements. It was not any sound in her combat vocabulary, her territorial vocabulary, her threat vocabulary. It was not a sound she made at other dragons except once, except in the specific circumstance of standing over a nest and listening to the particular sounds inside eggs that meant the inhabitants were well. It came out of her like something that had been waiting. She did not examine it. She did not file it in the way she usually filed new information, sorting it neatly and efficiently into applicable categories. She simply allowed it to exist, this sound, and when it had finished existing she remained still for another long moment, the child holding the ridge of her nose with both small hands, still babbling his warm, formless sounds into the morning air. She brought her foreclaw forward, the same foreclaw that had torn iron gates from their stone housings, the same foreclaw that had, on 11 separate occasions across 60 years, ended things that did not want to be ended. She brought it forward with a care so extreme it was itself a kind of revelation, the absolute opposite of every purpose for which this particular instrument had ever been used, and she curved it beneath him. She lifted him from the cold stone with the steadiness of something that has decided it will not tremble, and she held the full unbearable fragility of him as though he were the most precious and dangerous thing she had ever touched. Which she understood, in some way she could not immediately articulate, but which felt entirely certain he was. She turned and she carried him up the fortress steps, and she took him inside, out of the cold morning air, into the warmth of the place that was hers. The clay bowl of milk sat untouched at the base of the steps. Below in the village no one was watching, no one wanted the memory of it. They would not know for a long time what they had actually done. The raising. His name had been Emric, though no one in the village said it anymore. They had mourned him in the way that Ashenvail mourned most things in those years. Quietly, practically, with the particular efficiency of people who had already done a great deal of mourning, and had learned to keep it from consuming too much of the time needed for surviving. Cornyn the Elder had said a few words at the small ceremony, standing before the empty space where a body would have been, and the words he chose were careful and general and avoided the specific truth of how the child had come to be absent. He spoke of necessity. He spoke of the village's survival. He spoke of the boy's parents both gone before him and suggested that perhaps the family was together now in whatever place came after. The villagers who had known Merit wept for her son. The ones who had not knew enough to weep anyway, because the shape of the story, orphan, fever, father taken by war, was familiar in the way that tragedies become familiar when they happen often enough. And familiarity does not diminish them, but it does change the texture of the grief. They built a quiet sorrow around the name Emric and set it in the corner of the village's collective memory where the other necessary sorrows lived. And then, because they had to, they got on with things. Inside the fortress, he was not dead. He was not dead, and he was not diminishing, and he was not, by any observable measure, suffering. He was, in fact, thriving in the full physical, unambiguous sense of the word, in the way that a plant thrust unexpectedly into good soil thrives, putting out growth in all directions with an enthusiasm that suggests it has decided to make up for lost time. He was warm because Vraxen ran hotter than any hearth fire, and the hollow of her foreleg where he slept was a pocket of consistent, radiating heat that no stone wall or wool blanket could have equaled. He was fed because Vraxen had resolved the question of his feeding with the same methodical approach she applied to all logistical problems. She studied it, identified what was required, and provided it. This had required, in the first weeks, a certain degree of experimentation. She understood in principle that human young required milk, and she understood where milk came from, and she resolved the supply question by bringing a she-goat up the fortress path, alive, which was unusual for things that made the journey to her residence, and installing it in the lower courtyard with access to hay that she sourced from the valley fields at night. The goat was deeply unhappy about its situation, but was not, to its evident surprise, eaten. Emric was fed, the goat was not eaten. Both of these outcomes represented small miracles of a different kind than the ones the villagers prayed for. The learning happened faster than she expected, and Vraxen was not accustomed to being surprised by the pace of things. She had expected him to be a slow project. She had understood in the abstract that human young developed more gradually than dragon young, required more time to become functional, were for a longer period entirely dependent on external provision of everything needed for survival. She had factored this in. She had prepared mentally for years of one-directional effort, she providing, he receiving, the relationship asymmetrical for a long time before it began to balance. What she had not factored in was his attention. He watched everything. His eyes tracked her constantly, with the intense focused concentration of someone who has decided that the thing in front of them is the most important information source available and intends to extract everything from it. He watched how she moved, how she positioned herself, how she entered and exited spaces, how she sorted through things with her claws, how she read the weather coming in from the north by the particular angle at which she raised her head. He watched and watched and watched, and he was quiet while he watched, which she had not expected. She had expected more noise from him, had braced for the near-constant crying that the scholars mentioned as a characteristic of human young. But Imric had apparently decided that watching was more productive than crying, and allocated his time accordingly. He was not without noise. He had a hunger cry that was short, repetitive, and impossible to misinterpret. He had a frightened cry that was higher in pitch and had an edge of genuine desperation that she found. She did not have a comfortable word for what she found it. She filed the response it produced in her under operationally relevant, which was accurate but incomplete. The frightened cry produced in her an immediate physical response. She was moving before she had consciously decided to move, orienting toward the source, body already configuring for intervention. She cataloged this response the first time it happened and accepted it as a new constant in her operational parameters. He also had a sound he made when he was content, a low, humming, self-directed sound that he produced apparently for his own satisfaction, lying on her foreleg in the evening with his eyes half closed, watching the fire she kept in the great hearth of the fortress hall. This sound she did not catalog. She simply listened to it. This seemed sufficient. The putting things in his mouth phase lasted the better part of a year, and it reshaped the interior of the fortress more thoroughly than any enemy ever had. The fortress had accumulated, over its decades of abandonment and its years as her residence, a significant quantity of objects that were either dangerous or small enough to be dangerous or dangerous because they were small. Old weapons, corroded but still pointed, fragments of stone from collapsed sections of wall, the scattered remnants of the previous human inhabitants' lives, coins, buckles, clasps, all the small metal hardware of human existence. Bones from her meals, some of them with edges. She moved all of it. She was thorough about this in the way she was thorough about everything, conducting a systematic survey of every space he could access and clearing hazards with the same methodical attention she brought to perimeter defense. It took the better part of 3 weeks, and at the end she had a collection of potentially hazardous small objects in a sealed upper room that said something, she supposed, about the kind of creature she had become, that she was now in the business of baby-proofing. The word didn't exist in her language. She invented one, small securing, it sounded better. He walked at 11 months, which she later learned was early for his kind, though she had no way of knowing this at the time and simply noted it as a development and adapted accordingly. The walking was preceded by several weeks of increasingly ambitious crawling, followed by a period of pulling himself upright against her foreleg, and standing with the intense concentration of someone performing a complex calculation, followed by the first actual independent steps, which happened on an afternoon in late autumn when she was watching him from across the hall, and he simply stood up from where he had been sitting and walked 4 steps to where she was and sat down again. As though he had simply been waiting until he was certain before committing. She made the sound. She did not mean to make it, it simply came out of her, the same sound that had come out of her on the steps that first morning, the one without a name. He looked up at her when she made it, and he made a sound back, not the same, not even close to the same. His throat was not built for it, but clearly responsive, clearly a reply. And they regarded each other for a moment across the accomplishment of 4 steps on a cold stone floor, as though they had both understood something that did not need further articulation. The falling phase was harder. He was fearless in a way that she found simultaneously admirable and operationally exhausting. He did not have the instinctive caution that her own young would have had, the inborn sense of scale, the understanding of consequence, the healthy wariness of heights and edges that self-preservation builds into creatures who live near them. He had none of this. He had curiosity, which was in many ways the more powerful force, and it drove him toward every ledge, every crumbling staircase, every broken battlement with a view over the valley. She watched all of it. She watched with the specific hypervigilance of a creature who has accepted a responsibility and intends to meet it with complete commitment, which meant she was almost never fully at rest while he was awake, because rest required a degree of attentional withdrawal she was no longer able to afford. The ledge incident happened when he was 14 months old. He had climbed, and she was still not entirely certain how he had achieved the climb, which said something about the problem, to a low interior ledge perhaps 8 feet above the hall floor, a remnant of some old architectural feature whose purpose had been lost to time. He had been sitting there for several minutes, which she had been monitoring, and she had been calculating the probability of him coming down safely on his own versus requiring intervention, when he leaned forward to see something below, and the lean became a fall. She was beneath him before he reached the midpoint of the fall. This was not a boast, it was a simple fact of the geometry involved. Her reflex was faster than gravity over 8 feet, which she had not previously had occasion to test, but which proved true when tested. He landed on her back. On the scales between her shoulder ridges bounced once and lay there for a moment in stunned silence. Then he screamed. Not an injured scream, she checked immediately, thoroughly, and found no injury. A frightened scream delayed, the body's report of something that had happened faster than the mind could process in real time, arriving several seconds after the event it was reporting on. He screamed with the full commitment of someone who had just discovered that the world contained the possibility of falling, and this discovery was enormous and terrible and required expression. She made the sound. The low one, the specific one, the one she had developed over the previous months for exactly this category of event. The rumble that meant you're safe, I am here, or that contained those meanings among others, because it also meant I had you before you finished falling, and I will always have you before you finish falling. And the ground is not something you will hit while I exist, and possibly some other things as well that did not have even approximate translations but were present in the sound nonetheless. He screamed louder for a moment, which she had learned was normal. Comfort often produces an intensification of the feeling it's meant to address before it produces relief, because the permission to feel safe allows the full weight of the fear to arrive. She waited. She kept making the sound. After a while, the screaming became crying, and the crying became hiccuping, and the hiccuping became the sniffling sound of someone returning from the far country of genuine fright, and then he curled against the side of her neck and was quiet. She sat with him until the quiet became the particular quality of quiet that meant he had fallen asleep, and then she sat a while longer, and she thought about ledges, and about the inventory of additional ledge-adjacent hazards in the fortress, and about the specific nature of what she had felt in the fraction of a second between him beginning to fall and her being beneath him. She did not have a word for it. She filed it where she filed the other things without words. He learned her language before he learned his own, which she had not anticipated but which, in retrospect, made a kind of sense. He was immersed in it from the beginning. It was the only language in the space, the only communication available, and he absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, through long attention, through repetition, through the careful empirical method of noting what sound preceded what event until the pattern was undeniable. By 8 months, he had differentiated her warning sounds from her neutral sounds. By 10 months, he responded to her name for him, a short resonant sound in the low register, not translatable into human phonetics but unambiguous in intent, by turning his head and meeting her eye. By 14 months, the age of the ledge incident, he was producing his own versions of several of her basic sounds, altered by the limitations of his throat and chest but recognizable, functional, correctly deployed. He knew when she was pleased. He knew this with confidence and acted on the knowledge, repeating behaviors that produced it, the small, careful ways he demonstrated that he had learned something, that he had remembered a lesson, that he was attending to the world with the thoroughness she valued. He was, she recognized, trying to please her. This might have concerned her, the instinct to perform for approval rather than to act from internal standard. It was a weakness she had observed in other creatures, the way approval-seeking could be exploited, except that she watched closely and saw that his internal standard and his performed standard were the same. He was not doing the right thing in order to be seen doing it. He was doing the right thing and wanted her to know he was doing it, which was a different matter and one she could respect. He knew when she was warning him. He knew the escalating series of sounds from mild caution through serious concern to imminent consequence, and he had learned to stop and assess when she was in the caution range rather than requiring the conversation to proceed to its less pleasant later stages. This had taken time. He had required several iterations of the full escalation sequence to understand that the sequence was not decorative, that the later stages meant what they sounded like they meant, and she had delivered those later stages without pulling them, because giving him a version of consequence that was softer than the real version would have taught him a version of consequence that did not exist in the actual world, and that was not a lesson she was willing to teach. He had cried those early times at the full weight of her displeasure. She had let him cry, and when the crying was finished, she had brought him close and held him in her foreleg and let him understand that the displeasure was over, that it was, as it had always been, about the action and not about him, about the present moment and not the totality of her regard. He learned this. It took a few iterations, but he learned it. And after that, when she escalated, he would stop and assess and reconsider and make a different choice, and look at her with the expression of someone checking their work. She did not tell him this expression made the sound want to come out of her. Some information she had learned was not operationally useful to share. What she had not prepared herself for was the grief. She grieved still. Not constantly, the acute phase had passed into something more chronic, less jagged, more like a permanent change in the landscape of herself than like a wound. But it came on her sometimes, usually in the late evenings when the light was a certain quality and the fortress was quiet and Imric was asleep. and she would sit with it in the way she had learned to sit with it, which was to let it exist without fighting it and without indulging it, because it was part of what was true about her, and she did not falsify the things that were true about her. She thought she was quiet about this. She was not apparently as quiet about it as she believed. She learned this one evening when she had thought him asleep. His breathing had the rhythm of sleep, she had been certain of it, and she had let the grief come and sat with it in the stillness of the hall, and then she had felt the small weight of him press against her side. Not words, not sounds, just presence. His hand flat against her scales, his weight settled into her, his breathing still slow and even in the pattern that might have been sleep, except that sleeping things do not choose to press themselves against you in the specific way that says I know. I am here. She did not make any sound, he did not make any sound. They sat in the quiet together, the way she had taught him without intending to teach it. That some feelings do not need words, that sometimes presence is the whole of what is needed, that to be witnessed in a hard moment by something that loves you is its own complete language. She had not known she was teaching him this. She had simply been being what she was, and he had been watching and he had learned. She taught him everything she knew that could be translated. She taught him the sky. She taught him the difference between the high, thin clouds that meant cold, dry air moving in from the north and the layered gray clouds that built from the southeast when the warm, wet air came in off the distant coast. She taught him to read the behavior of the mountain birds, the way the smaller ones descended to lower elevations hours before serious weather, the way the raptors shifted their hunting patterns when pressure was falling. She taught him that wind had directions and that the directions told you things, that smell was information and that information was survival, that the world was constantly communicating and that most creatures lacked the patience to listen. She taught him tracks. She taught him to distinguish between the gait patterns of the valley deer in different seasons, to identify the difference between a track made this morning and a track made yesterday, to read the story that a set of prints told about the creature that had made them, its pace, its health, its intention. She taught him this not because she thought he would need to hunt on foot, which seemed inefficient for a creature of his capabilities, but because knowing the world at ground level was different from knowing it from the air, and she wanted him to know it at every level. She taught him patience, which was perhaps the lesson she was most qualified to teach, having had centuries to develop it. She taught him that the correct response to not knowing something was not to act anyway but to wait and observe until you knew enough to act well. She taught him that most problems that seemed urgent were not, and that the few problems that actually were urgent could be identified by specific characteristics that she helped him learn to recognize. She had no framework for any of this. There was no tradition she was drawing from, no accumulated wisdom of dragon mothers who had raised human young, no precedent of any kind. She was building the thing from materials she had her own experience, her observation of him, her willingness to revise when the approach she had tried proved wrong, and she was aware of the limitations of this but saw no alternative. She raised him as she would have raised her own, with honesty about the world and what it contained, with patience for the time required to learn it, with the consistent underlying expectation that he was capable of becoming something that understood itself and its place in things with clarity and without illusion. This was the most important thing she gave him. Not the knowledge was tool and could be supplemented. It was the expectation. The fundamental, unwavering, never once doubted expectation that he would grow into something capable. He was 5 when the hunter from Ashenvail stumbled up the path following a wounded elk. Emric was sitting on the outer wall, his legs dangling over the valley below, watching the early afternoon light move across the hills in the way it did in autumn when the air was clear. The shadows of clouds running across the landscape like something alive, like the valley was breathing. He liked this wall. He had been sitting on it since he was old enough to climb the steps to it, and Vraxen had long since stopped worrying about it because she had long since accurately assessed that he was not going to fall, that his sense of his own body in space was good, and his comfort with heights was genuine rather than reckless. She was behind him on the upper parapet, visible, as she almost always was, a vast dark shape against the pale stone, her tail curved down and around the base of the wall in the unconscious habit that had developed over years. The tail was not deliberate. It was simply where it ended up when she was near him and relaxed, and it formed around the foot of his position on the wall in a way that meant something to anyone looking at it, even if they didn't have words for what it meant. The hunter came around the bend in the upper path and stopped. He was a young man, not yet 30, with the look of someone who had been intent on something and had arrived somewhere entirely different from where he intended. He had an arrow on his bow he had been tracking, and when he saw Vraxen, the bow came up before his mind had caught up with his reflexes. Then he saw the boy on the wall. He stood very still for a long time. Vraxen watched him from the parapet with the stillness of something deciding. The hunter understood on a level beneath thought that he was currently in the assessment phase of a process he did not want to reach the conclusion of, and he stood very still and did not move the bow. Emric turned at the sound of the stopped footsteps. He had good ears, she had made sure of that, and looked at the hunter with the direct, assessing gaze that was, if anyone had known it, entirely hers. "Are you lost?" he asked. His voice was clear and steady. It had an accent that belonged nowhere, not Ashenvail, not any valley village, not any human place. It had the cadences of the mountains in it, the rhythms of a language that was not quite any human language, the particular shaped quality of speech learned in a large stone space from a teacher who communicated meaning through resonance and intention as much as through words. The hunter did not answer immediately. He was looking at the boy with the specific expression of someone whose understanding of the world is undergoing rapid revision. "Are you," he started, he tried again, "are you Emric?" The boy tilted his head in a way that was not quite a human gesture. "That is my name," he said, as though confirming information he found mildly interesting. The hunter went back down the mountain and the story he brought was not believed, and then 4 villagers came up together and saw for themselves, and they stood in the fortress courtyard and looked at the boy who was healthy and solid and holy himself. And Vraxen watched from the heights and did not descend, and did not need to. They asked if he wanted to come home. He heard the word they used, home, and he understood what it was pointing at, the village below, the place he had theoretically originated, and he considered it with genuine thought, the way she had taught him to consider things thoroughly and without predetermined conclusion. Then he looked up at her on the wall. She was watching him. She did not make any sound. She had told him once early when she was still working out how to tell him things, "I will not make your choices. I will give you what you need to make them." She had given him what he needed. The rest was his. He looked at her for a moment with the eyes the color of warm bark, almost amber in good light. He looked back at the people from the village below. "I am home," he said, with the complete simplicity of a statement that does not require defense because it is simply true. He turned and walked back inside. Above on the wall, Vraxen was still and silent and entirely herself, and the sound that was not quite any sound in any language came out of her very quietly into the cold autumn air, and meant all the things it always meant and some new things besides. The understanding. He was 17 when the soldiers came. Not from Ashenvail. Ashenvail had long since made its peace with the arrangement, in the quiet practical way of people who have decided that a situation which is not actively harming them is not worth the cost of challenging. The village had its own complicated relationship with what lived above it and what lived inside it, a relationship built across years of careful non-interference that had calcified over time into something resembling uneasy coexistence. They left the fortress alone. The fortress left them alone. The boy on the wall, when he was occasionally visible to those who looked up at the right moment, had ceased to be a source of horror and become, in the strange alchemy of familiarity, a kind of landmark. The soldiers came from the capital, which was 3 days' hard ride to the west, and which had its own relationship with distant problems. Specifically, the relationship of a bureaucracy that had received a report and was obligated to act on it regardless of whether the report bore any resemblance to the truth. Word had traveled, as word always does, and it had been reshaped by each pair of hands that carried it, each mouth that passed it on, each mind that received it and translated it through the filter of what it already believed. What had left Ashenvail as there is a boy who lives with the dragon and appears to be well had passed through a merchant who embellished for drama, a courier who misheard, a minor clerk who summarized imprecisely, and 2 more intermediaries before it arrived at the desk of Lord Haverth, Earl of the Eastern Reach, as something altogether different. What the Earl read was this: the Ashen Dragon of the Shattered Peaks holds a human child in captivity, using him as a hostage to prevent military action against her territory. The Earl was a conscientious man. He was also a man who had built his reputation on decisive responses to threats, and a dragon holding a human child hostage was the kind of clear and actionable threat that a man of his temperament was constitutionally incapable of leaving unaddressed. He dispatched 2 companies of cavalry, 60 men in total, well-armed, well-mounted, and attached to them 1 Merit Solen battle mage of the 3rd rank, whose specialty was large creature suppression, and whose confidence in her own abilities was, by most accounts, not unjustified. They came at dawn, which was sound tactical thinking. Dawn put the sun behind the approaching force, made them harder to spot from the heights, and gave them the full day to accomplish their objective before the vulnerability of making a mountain camp after dark. It was well planned. It demonstrated that someone in the capital had thought seriously about this operation. What they had not factored into their planning, could not have factored in, having no way to know, was the 17-year-old boy sitting on the high parapet who had been awake for 2 hours before they arrived. Emmerich did not sleep much past the first light. This had been true as long as he could remember, something in him oriented toward dawn the way some plants oriented toward the sun, waking before it arrived, drawn to the specific quality of light that existed in the half-hour before sunrise when the sky was the color of a bruised fatting and the valley below was still layered in soft darkness. He had spent thousands of these mornings on this parapet, and each one was different in the specific ways that mornings are different from each other if you are paying attention, and he was always paying attention. He had learned to pay attention from the only teacher he had ever had, and she was not the kind of teacher whose lessons were theoretical. He saw the column when it was still far below, at the point in the lower valley road where the tree cover thinned and the road ran through open meadow for a mile before the foothills began. The early light caught metal helmets, lance points, the bridle fittings of 60 well-outfitted horses, and the column resolved into a purposeful, organized advance that was moving with the specific intent of something that knew where it was going. He sat with it for a moment. He assessed the size, the formation, the pace. He estimated arrival time. He read the manner of the column, not rushed, not uncertain, the movement of a force that had orders and intended to execute them, and he understood the shape of the situation before he had any of its particulars. Then he went to find Vraxen. She was in the upper hall as she often was at this hour, her great body filling the space in the comfortable way of something that has occupied a place for long enough that the place has shaped itself around it. She appeared to be resting. Her eyes were partially closed, her breathing slow, the deep measured rhythm that he had learned to distinguish from true sleep years ago. This was rest, not sleep, the body still and the mind elsewhere. The eyes opened fully as he came through the arch, before he had made any sound. "There are soldiers coming," he said. "A column, cavalry, at least 2 companies, something else at the rear. I couldn't identify it from the parapet, but the posture was wrong for a soldier." A mage, Vraxen said in the low, resonant language they had always spoken together. "There is one. I can feel the workings being prepared. She has been preparing since they came around the lower pass." He had not known she could sense that from this distance. He filed this away, as he filed everything she told him, some information you stored for practical use, and some you stored because it was part of the ongoing project of understanding the person who had given it to you. And with Vraxen, after 17 years, the 2 categories had become largely inseparable. "How long have you been awake?" "Long enough," a pause that he knew meant she had been awake significantly longer than she intended to indicate. "They will want to fight," she continued, and there was in the word *fight the particular inflection, not quite contempt, not quite pity, something occupying the narrow, uncomfortable space between the two, that she used for a specific category of human behavior. The behavior of people who had decided on an outcome before they understood a situation, and were now committed to the outcome regardless of what the situation turned out to actually be. "They'll want to rescue me," he said. "They will want to be heroes," a slight shift in tone, a darkening that made the distinction precise. "It is a different thing." He stood with this for a moment. He was 17, which meant he had enough experience to understand it and not quite enough to have lost the small flinch that understanding sometimes produced. He knew what she was saying. Heroes needed the story to be simple, captive and captor, victim and rescuer, the clean geometry of a situation that could be resolved with sufficient force applied in the right direction. Heroes were not, as a general category, well served by complexity. "Can I speak to them first?" he asked, "before it goes anywhere else?" She was quiet in the particular way she was quiet when the decision was real, not the brief silence of processing, not the longer silence of disagreement being considered, but the specific held quiet of weighing something that had more than one legitimate answer and choosing carefully between them. He had learned all her silences the way you learn a landscape you have walked every day of your life, not as a studied map but as a felt thing, known in the body before it was known in the mind. "Do not stand in front of me when you do," she said finally. "Stand to my left." He understood immediately. He had spent 17 years learning her, and this instruction was not tactical advice, or not only tactical advice. To her left was her shielded side, yes, the side with the heavier scales, the side she turned toward threats when she could choose her orientation. But standing at her left was not the position of someone being protected by someone standing behind them. It was not the position of a ward, a dependent, a child kept behind an adult's body. It was the position of someone standing beside her. She was telling him something, and the thing she was telling him was not about the soldiers. It was about the 2 of them, about what they were to each other, about the shape of the encounter she intended and the statement she intended the shape to make. She would be beside him, not over him, not behind him, not acting on his behalf while he stood clear, beside him, equal in the thing they were about to do. He nodded and they went to the gate together. The courtyard of the old fortress was large enough to hold the column and leave room, which was either fortunate or unfortunate depending on what happened next. The cavalry came through the outer gate in formation and drew up with professional precision, horses shuffling and blowing in the early cold, breath misting, metal fittings catching the risen sun. At the rear, as Vraxen had said, the battle mage, a compact woman in traveling clothes with the stillness of someone actively working, her hands moving in small, deliberate patterns at her sides, her eyes already on the upper shadows of the courtyard walls. And then they saw Vraxen. There was a specific quality to the silence that fell when people saw Vraxen up close for the first time. Imric had observed it before on the 4 villagers who had come up years ago, on the occasional trader who had taken a wrong path and arrived somewhere very different from their intended destination. It was not the silence of awe exactly, though awe was in it. It was the silence of the body redirecting all available resources to the single question of how large is this and how far can I get in the time available. It was the silence of recalculation. She sat at the far end of the courtyard in the full risen light, and she was enormous in a way that even knowing she was enormous did not prepare you for, because knowing and seeing were different countries and the border between them could not be crossed by description. Her scales were the color of deep water at night, not black exactly, more the kind of dark that has other colors living in it, that shifts when the light shifts. Her eyes, both open and tracking the column with the steady, unhurried attention of something that is deciding rather than reacting, were the amber of resin, the amber of light through dark honey, and they missed nothing. The battlemaid's hands stopped moving. The captain of the lead company, a career soldier experienced, not easily rattled, took a controlled breath and held his formation, which was the right thing to do and required genuine self-command. Emric stepped forward. He did not look at them the way a rescued person looks at rescuers. He did not look at them the way a captive looks at anything, the particular combination of hope and caution, and suppressed desperation that captivity produces in people who have not stopped wanting to leave. He looked at them with Vraxen's eyes, or not her eyes exactly but her quality of looking, the assessment that preceded judgment and did not hurry toward it, that collected what was actually in front of it rather than what it expected to find. He was not what any of them had expected. They had expected on some level, even the experienced captain, even the battle mage, they had expected to find someone diminished, someone marked by years of wrong circumstances. The story they had been sent to resolve was a story about a victim, and victims in the grammar of rescue narratives look a certain way, diminished, grateful, visibly relieved by the arrival of help. He stood straight and he was solid, and his clothes were well made from materials that spoke of someone who had been clothed with care. He had the lean build of someone who had grown up in cold air with significant physical demands, and the posture of someone who had never learned to make himself smaller. His face was open and attentive and expressed no relief at their presence whatsoever. He said what he said, clearly, without preamble, without the performance of emotion that people sometimes use to signal that they understand the gravity of a moment. She is not holding me. She raised me. There is a difference, and I would appreciate it if you took a moment to understand it before someone does something that cannot be undone. The last clause was not delivered as a threat. It was delivered as information. It was the more effective for being the latter, because threats could be weighed and challenged and refused, but information simply sat in the space and waited to be true. The battlemaid's hands were still, the captain had not moved. You were taken as an infant, the captain said. He chose his words carefully, the way a person chooses footing on uncertain ground, testing each surface before committing weight. Whatever has happened since whatever you believe you were taken, you were not given a choice. Emric looked at him. Something moved in his expression that was not anger, was the quieter, more durable thing that lives in the same territory as anger but does not have its heat. I was left, he said. 2 words, he let them exist in the space for a moment before he continued. By your people in the cold alone at the base of those steps. He did not gesture, did not need to before dawn. No one stayed to see what happened, no one watched. They left me because I was an infant without parents in a village without resources and I was convenient. He said it without heat, which was the most devastating possible way to say it because heat would have been arguable and this was not arguable. She is the one who came down the steps, she is the one who stayed. The word asterisk stayed, fell into the silence of the courtyard and did not echo, but it had the quality of an echo, a sound that continued after it had finished, that went on doing something in the minds of those who heard it. Behind him, Vraxen made a sound. Low, resonant, felt in the chest before it was heard by the ears. The horses communicated their opinion of this sound immediately and eloquently, several of them stepping backward or sideways without their rider's instruction. The instinctive wisdom of prey animals who understand at a cellular level when they are in the presence of something that could end them. Emric knew the sound. He had always known it. It was among the first things he had learned to know before he could speak or walk or do anything except watch and listen and categorize. It meant, in the precise translation he had spent 17 years developing, well said, exactly so. No one else in the courtyard knew what it meant. But the captain heard it, and whatever argument had been forming behind his eyes paused, and the battle mage heard it and her hands remained still. The negotiation took most of the day. It was not in its first hours quite a negotiation. It was more a gradual, difficult process by which a group of people who had arrived with a fixed story were required, against their preferences, to exchange that story for one that was more complicated and more accurate. This process resembled negotiation in its surface features. There was talking, there was listening, there were periods of silence and periods of questions, but its essential nature was closer to translation. Emmerich was translating, not only Vraxen's language into human language, though that too, when she chose to speak. He was translating the entire situation, the entire 17 years of it, from the version that had arrived in the courtyard with 60 cavalry and a battle mage into the version that was actually true. He did this with patience. He had learned patience from the most patient creature he knew, the one sitting at the far end of the courtyard, with the stillness of something that had decided to allow this process to reach its conclusion on its own time. He told them about the morning on the steps, the wool cloth, the clay bowl, the cold, the fact of being left. He told them this not to produce guilt, though he understood it would produce guilt, and did not arrange his telling to prevent that, because the truth was the truth, and he had been taught that the truth did not need softening to be told. He told them about growing up in the fortress, about the goat, about learning to read the sky and the tracks and the language of a creature whose language had not previously been thought learnable by human throats. He told them about the ledge, about the hunting, about evenings on the parapet watching the valley light change through all its seasons. He told them about the grief because he thought they should know that Vraxen had grief. He thought this was important, that the creature they had come to neutralize was not a force of nature without interiority but a being who had lost things and continued to carry the loss. He did not explain the eggs, that was not his to share. He said only that she had lost something before he came, that the loss had not finished, and that some of the things she had done in her long life had been done from grief, and that this did not excuse them but it contextualized them in ways that the histories did not. The captain listened. He was a better man than Emmerich had initially read him as, a man capable of revising his understanding when presented with evidence, which was not as common a quality as it should have been. He asked questions that were honest questions, the questions of someone trying to understand rather than trying to build a case. The battle mage said very little for most of the day. She watched Vraxen. Vraxen watched her. This mutual watching had the quality of two very capable entities taking accurate measure of each other and arriving at conclusions they were both filing away for future reference. At one point late in the afternoon, the battle mage said something very quietly to the captain that Emmerich did not hear, and the captain nodded slowly. Vraxen spoke 3 times throughout the day. The first time was when the captain asked, directly, what she wanted from the valley, what her intentions were, what she expected, what would satisfy her and produce lasting peace. This was the real question, the question that everything else was preliminary to, and the captain asked it with the straightforwardness of someone who had decided to simply be direct about the thing they needed to know. Vraxen was quiet for a long moment. I want, she said, and Emmerich translated as she spoke, watching the captain's face as the words arrived, to be left alone to live in my own place with what is mine. I want the passes left clear. I want no armies in my peaks. I want no more soldiers sent to tell me what I am allowed to do in my own territory. A pause. I have not touched your valley. I have not taken from it since he came. I hunt in the high ranges and I do not come below the tree line. I ask the same courtesy in return. It was the most words he had ever directed at humans. Emmerich knew this and understood what it meant, that she had judged this worth saying, which meant she had judged this worth trying, which meant something she did not say in words but which was present in the quality of her voice and the stillness of her body, and the fact that she was here at all, sitting in this courtyard instead of ending the conversation in the faster way available to her. The second time was when a young cavalryman, nervous, young, attempting to demonstrate competence and achieving instead the demonstration of inexperience, made a comment to his companion that was not meant to be heard by Emmerich, but was in fact clearly audible from where he stood. The comment concerned the probability that the boy was not entirely himself, had been affected somehow, could not be trusted to accurately represent his own interests. Vraxen spoke one word. It was not translatable. It was not in the frequency range of human speech. It was felt more than heard, a single low syllable that arrived in the chest and stayed there, and it communicated without ambiguity that there was a line in the courtyard and the young cavalryman was on the wrong side of it. The young cavalryman went immediately quiet and did not speak again. The third time was near the end, when the terms had been discussed and the captain had asked if she would hold to what was agreed. The question carried in it, carefully but unmistakably, the acknowledged absurdity of asking a dragon for her word, The question of what a dragon's word was worth, whether the concept applied, whether any of this was binding in any sense that a human court would recognize. I have held to things without being asked to hold to them, Vraxen said, for 17 years. She let this stand without elaboration because it did not require elaboration. The statement was its own evidence. The captain looked at Emric. Emric looked back at him and said nothing because nothing was the correct response. The statement had been complete and adding to it would have diminished it. The captain nodded, not the nod of someone agreeing to terms he would later contest. The nod of someone who had been persuaded of something he had not come here expecting to be persuaded of, and who was honest enough to acknowledge the persuasion. The soldiers left before dark, as Vraxen had known they would. She had known this hours before they knew it themselves, had read the shift in the negotiation from resistance to acceptance before any of the humans in the courtyard had consciously registered it. She could read the small things, the micro-adjustments of posture, the shifts in breathing, the changes in the quality of listening. She had read them all day. Emric had read them too because she had taught him to. When the last of the column disappeared around the bend of the lower path, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the early evening air, he climbed. He went up the way he always went up when there was something to think about or something to feel that required height and perspective and cold air, moving up the inner stairs, through the third passage, out onto the high parapet where the view was longest, where the valley spread below in all directions, where the sky was a full half of what existed. The light was doing the particular thing it did in late afternoon in autumn, going gold and then going amber and then going the deep reddish bronze that lasted only a few minutes before the sun fell below the western ridge and took it all away. The valley in this light looked like something from a story, the kind of story where things are more saturated with meaning than ordinary objects, where the light itself is trying to say something. Vraxen came up the far side and settled beside him, her great body blocking the wind from the north, which was a quality of her presence he had appreciated since childhood. He sat on the parapet wall. She sat beside him in the way she sat beside him, vast and settled and close, the warmth of her radiating out into the cooling air. "They'll come back eventually," he said, "or others will, the story won't stay quiet." "Yes, asterisk," she agreed. It was the agreement of someone who had thought about this longer than he had, from a perspective that spanned more time than his life, and who had arrived at the agreement from a different direction but at the same destination. Yes, of course they would come back. This was how it worked. You could not change the fact of the story by changing one chapter of it. The story was too old, too set, too deeply bedded into how humans understood dragons and what dragons meant and what was owed to both. And one day's negotiation in a mountain courtyard, however well it had gone, was one day's negotiation. "That doesn't bother you?" She turned her head, and the amber eye that turned toward him was the same eye that had looked at him from the cold stone of the fortress steps 17 years ago, that had been level with him when he was small enough to grab it with both hands, that had watched him take his first steps and fall from the ledge and stand at this same parapet in every season and every quality of light and become, incrementally, the person he was. The same eye that had watched him stand in the courtyard today and say she is the one who stayed, and had made the sound that meant asterisk exactly so. "Many things will come," she said. She said it in the low register that meant she was speaking a complete thought, a considered thought, one she had arrived at by the slow, careful route of true understanding. "They will find us here." He leaned against her side. The scales were warm from the day's sun and from the constant heat of her, the deep banked fire of what she was, and he pressed his shoulder against them and felt the steadiness of her the way he had always felt it, not as protection, not as shelter, but as something more fundamental than either of those things. As ground. As the kind of ground that does not shift. He watched the last of the amber light move across the valley below, the shadows lengthening, the hills going from golden to brown to blue, the sky deepening toward the first dark. "Good," he said. And meant it the way she had taught him to mean things, completely and without reservation, with the full weight of 17 years behind the single word. Meant it because here was true. Meant it because she was here. Meant it because whatever came next, they were here, they would be here, and the thing they were to each other was not something that could be ended by a column of cavalry or a battle mage or the Earl of the Eastern Reach or anything the world was likely to send up this mountain. They were still in the cooling dark as the valley lost its light. The fortress was quiet around them. The goat, long since replaced by its grandchildren and relocated to a proper pen in the lower courtyard, was quiet. The mountain was quiet. The wind came through from the north, cold and clean, carrying the smell of altitude and distance and the specific ancient smell of stone. Vraxen made a sound very quietly into the evening air. It did not have a translation. It had never had a translation. He had stopped trying to translate it years ago and simply let it be what it was, the sound she made when things were as they should be, when the world contained what it was supposed to contain, when the evening came down over a particular valley with a particular 17-year-old boy against her side. and all the things that could have gone differently had not gone differently. He listened to it the way he had always listened to it. With the whole of himself completely the way she had taught him.